There's a story told sometimes, not in books, but in the quiet nods between men who have seen too many sunrises from a factory floor, or felt the ache of a wrench in their hand longer than they remember. It's about a kind of scar we all carry, some deeper than others, from the scrapes and knocks of growing up. Most folks, they just try to hide that scar, bury it under a pile of bills and long work days. They figure it's a weakness, a mark of what broke them. But every now and then, if you look close enough, you'll see a man who figured out that the deepest cuts, the ones that nearly took him out, well, those were the ones that made him strong enough to build something real. That man could have been Eugene. He was 48, just another face in the blur of fluorescent lights at the stamping plant, a veteran of 25 years on the line. He moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who knew every bolt and every grind of the machinery, his body a map of a life spent in constant motion, constantly working. His hands, thick and calloused, were permanently stained with grease and tiny scars from stray metal shards, hands that had hoisted untold tons of steel, that had learned the stubborn language of broken machines. His face was a roadmap too, etched with lines around eyes that held a quiet strength, but also a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. You saw him, and you knew this wasn't a man who had ever taken the easy road. His uniform, perpetually faded blue, seemed less like a covering and more like a second skin, molded to his frame, a testament to countless shifts. He was one of those guys you trusted to get the job done, no fuss, no complaints, just the steady hum of a man who knew his place and his duty. But underneath that gruff, dependable exterior, a storm was always brewing, silent and unseen. Every weekday, the blare of his alarm clock at 5:00 a.m. was less a wake-up call and more a punch to the gut. The sound tore through the thin quiet of his modest, single-story house, a place where the air always felt a little stale, a little too still. Eugene would swing his legs out of bed, the old springs groaning in protest, and hit the cold linoleum floor of his bedroom. No time for coffee, not really. Just a quick splash of water on his face, the mirror showing a tired man who looked back with the same resignation he felt. The same faded blue uniform, pulled on, buttoned, ready for another 10 hours of standing, lifting, stamping. His truck, a Ford F-150 that had seen better decades, coughed to life in the pre-dawn darkness. The drive to the plant was always the same. Empty streets slowly filling with other ghosts, other working men heading to their own posts. The hum of the engine, the familiar turn of the wheel, the smell of diesel and damp morning air. It was a ritual he'd perfected, a practiced numbness. When he pulled into the factory parking lot, the sheer scale of the building always felt like a weight, a sprawling beast of corrugated steel and concrete that swallowed lives whole. Inside, the roar of the machines was an old friend, a constant, deafening reminder of where he was and what he was doing. Punching in, his badge a small, cold piece of plastic against his chest, the clock marking another day begun, another day bled. On the line, it was all repetition. The rhythmic thump-clank shriek of the press, the endless conveyor belt carrying raw metal to be formed, then stamped, then stacked. Eugene knew every nuance, every potential snag, every tremor that meant trouble was brewing. He could do his job blindfolded, his hands moving with an instinct born of years, his mind often drifting, a quiet rebel against the monotony. He wasn't a clock watcher, not really, but the slowing drag of each hour was a physical sensation. And at the end of it all, the fatigue settled deep in his bones, a constant companion. Home again, the house felt emptier than when he left it. Dinner was usually something simple, eaten alone, the silence punctuated only by the distant sounds of a neighbor's TV or a dog barking. Bills piled up on the kitchen table. Gas, electricity, property tax, a surprise repair on the truck. He'd stare at them, the numbers mocking him, a relentless tide of obligations that always seemed to rise faster than his paycheck. There was never enough left over, never enough to get ahead, just enough to tread water to keep his head above the surface for another month. It wasn't just the lack of luxury that bit at him. It was the suffocating feeling of being trapped, unable to break free from the cycle. This life, this endless cycle, was built on a foundation of something else, something deeper that gnawed at him when the silence was too loud. His childhood was a patchwork quilt of chaos and neglect, a series of sharp edges and cold shoulders. He'd learned early on that the only person he could rely on was himself, a lesson carved into his very being. The constant echoes of not being good enough, not being worthy, not having enough, they clung to him like dust, unseen but always there. He worked relentlessly, not just for the bills, but to outrun those echoes, to prove to some invisible judge that he was worthy, even if just of basic survival. But the proof never seemed to stick. He saw other men at the factory, younger ones, with families, with plans. He remembered having plans once, vague dreams of building something, anything with his own hands, something that lasted, something that wasn't just another part on a production line. But those dreams had long been buried under the weight of responsibility and the constant, nagging fear of failure. He pushed them down, kept them quiet, because dreams, he'd learned, could hurt the most when they shattered. He was a man who knew how to build, how to fix, how to survive, but deep down, he was terrified of truly living, of putting himself out there, of risking the pain of loss or the shame of not measuring up again. His past wasn't just behind him. It was a ghost in every corner of his present, keeping him isolated, keeping him small. He thought he was hiding it, burying it, but it was just quietly shaping him, making him fear vulnerability and success in equal measure. He believed his rough start was a permanent stain, a brand, not a blueprint. The buzz of the alarm clock sliced through the 5 a.m. darkness with surgical precision. Not an insistent, jarring sound, but a quiet, almost apologetic hum that had, over decades, become a part of Eugene's body clock, a dull throb in his bones. He was usually awake before it, lying there in the pre-dawn quiet, listening to the house settle, feeling the chill in the air against his worn sheet. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar creak of the springs a testament to his routine, and stand, stretching out the kinks in his back, a silent prayer of defiance against the aging that tried to slow him down. His single-story house, modest and well-kept, was a haven of order amidst the quiet chaos of his mind. The coffee maker, a relic of convenience, was set on a timer, its fragrant steam already filling the small kitchen. He'd pour himself a mug, black and strong, no frills, and stand by the window, watching the streetlights cut through the lingering gloom. The neighborhood was just stirring, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, a car door slamming. For Eugene, this was the quiet before the storm, the last few moments of solitude before the world demanded his presence. The drive to the factory was a blur of familiar turns, stoplights that always seemed to catch him, and the growing hum of traffic. The factory itself, a hulking monument of steel and concrete, loomed large, its smokestacks exhaling faint plumes into the brightening sky. Inside, it was a world of rhythmic clang and whir, the smell of grease and metal a constant companion. Eugene's station on the production line was a well-oiled machine, his hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had done the same task thousands upon thousands of times. He was good at it, dependable, a cog in the industrial wheel, essential but unremarkable. He'd fit the parts, check the gauges, send them down the line, his mind often drifting, a quiet observer of his own repetitive existence. Lunch was a solitary affair. A thermos of lukewarm coffee, a sandwich, usually leftovers, eaten in the break-room corner, far from the boisterous laughter of the younger guys. He'd read the local paper, a habit picked up from his father, looking at the headlines but rarely truly absorbing the words, his gaze often settling on the classifieds, though he never circled anything. Just a habit, a quiet contemplation of other lives, other opportunities he knew weren't for him. The evenings were much the same, a simple dinner prepared quickly, eaten without much ceremony. The news on the old TV muted just background noise to the thoughts that finally had room to breathe. Bills spread out on the kitchen table, an ongoing battle against rising costs and stagnant wages. Every dollar accounted for, every expense weighed. It wasn't poverty, not truly, but it was a life lived on the knife edge of just enough, a constant low hum of financial anxiety that never quite went away. He'd pay the mortgage, the utilities, the car insurance, and watch the numbers dwindle, always wondering if there would be enough left, a fear born from a childhood where there never was. As the sun set, casting long shadows across his well-tended lawn, Eugene would find himself caught in the quiet prison of his own mind. He was a man of routines, of meticulous habits, because chaos, he'd learned, was dangerous. But beneath the surface of his ordered life, the unspoken questions gnawed at him. He'd catch glimpses of himself in the reflection of the dark windowpane, a tired face, lines etched around his eyes that spoke of more than just age. It wasn't just the physical fatigue. It was the quiet despair that came from knowing his life had become a perpetual holding pattern. He remembered, faintly, the boy he used to be, the one who loved tinkering with broken things, who saw potential where others saw scrap. That boy had dreamed of building, not just assembling, but creating something from scratch, something that stood strong, something that mattered. But those dreams, vivid and urgent in his youth, had long since been buried under the rubble of a difficult past. They lay there not dead but dormant, a dull ache beneath his ribs, a phantom limb of a future that never materialized. The gap between who he was, a reliable, quiet factory worker living alone, paying his bills, and who he had once dared to dream of being, was a chasm. He saw it in the easy confidence of younger men, in the way they spoke of their aspirations without shame. For him, ambition had become a dangerous word, a temptation that could only lead to failure and the confirmation of his deepest fear, that he was, and always would be, not good enough. His childhood had taught him that vulnerability was a weakness, that relying on others was a fool's errand, and that success, if it ever came, was fleeting and often followed by a greater fall. So he built walls, brick by brick, not just around his heart, but around his aspirations. He believed his past was a permanent stain, a brand, not a blueprint. It was a weight he carried unseen, a constant reminder that he was destined for nothing more than quiet sustenance, forever fighting an invisible battle with his own self-worth. He kept his head down, worked hard, and hoped the echoes of his past would eventually fade, even as they continued to define every quiet, solitary moment. One Tuesday morning, just as the second shift was winding down and the air in the plant thickened with the smell of hot metal and fatigue, Eugene saw something that rattled the foundations he'd spent a lifetime constructing. He was at his station, methodically checking the tension on a conveyor belt, the kind of repetitive task he could do in his sleep, when a younger man, Marcus, came bustling past. Marcus was barely out of his 20s, fresh-faced despite the grime, with an infectious energy that often rubbed Eugene the wrong way. The kid had a past, a rough one, everyone knew it, bounced around foster homes, dropped out of school early, the whole 9 yards. Sounded eerily familiar to Eugene's own early life, only Marcus seemed to wear his scars differently. Marcus stopped, not in front of Eugene, but beside him, pulling a tattered notebook from his oil-stained overalls. "Hey, Eugene," he said, not waiting for a response. "Remember that grinding issue on line 7? The one that was costing us a whole half-hour of downtime every day last week?" Eugene grunted, not looking up. He remembered. He just figured it was another problem to live with. "Well, I got it," Marcus announced, a wide, genuine grin splitting his face. "Turns out if you just tweak the angle of the feeder plate by about 3 degrees, just a hair, it eliminates the back pressure." Been running smooth since lunch. Eugene slowly straightened up, the wrench still in his hand. He looked at Marcus, at the triumphant light in his eyes, not for recognition or reward, but for the sheer satisfaction of having fixed something. It wasn't a billion-dollar idea, not even a million-dollar one. It was a simple, practical solution to a persistent headache on the factory floor, the kind of small victory that goes unnoticed by management but saves real money and real frustration for the guys doing the work. For a moment, Eugene felt the familiar flicker of annoyance, a knee-jerk resentment for anyone who dared to show enthusiasm in this gray world. But then something else surfaced. He saw Marcus, not as a younger, irritating version of himself, but as a mirror. Marcus had faced the same kind of early life hardships, the same neglect, the same feeling of having to fight for every scrap. Yet here he was, not just surviving, but thriving in his own small way, finding solutions, making things better. He wasn't trying to bury his past. He was using the lessons of self-reliance, of figuring things out when no one else would, to propel him forward. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't paralyzed. A profound realization hit Eugene with the force of a physical blow. If Marcus, with his history, could find a way to use his difficult past as a launchpad, why couldn't he? Why had Eugene spent a lifetime seeing his own scar, not just as a wound, but as a permanent, debilitating flaw? He'd carried it like a dead weight, a constant proof of his inadequacy. But looking at Marcus, he saw something different. He saw that his own difficult past wasn't just a source of pain. It was a reservoir of raw experience, of fierce determination, of a stubborn refusal to break. It had made him who he was, yes, but it didn't have to define his limits. It could be channeled differently. He began to see his past not as a weakness, but as a unique strength, a deep well of resilience that had been forged in fire. The thought was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly alien. That night, the clock in Eugene's modest, quiet house ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2, eventually settling on the lonely, honest hour of 3 a.m. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent hum of the factory still echoing faintly in his ears, though he hadn't left his mattress. Marcus's face, his triumphant, simple grin, kept replaying in his mind. The raw truth of it was almost unbearable. He tossed, punched his pillow. The usual defenses, the thick walls he'd built over 4 decades, felt like they were crumbling around him. What had his life become? He was 48, alone in a house that felt less like a home and more like a shelter from the storm. The bills were paid, sure, the fridge was stocked, the car ran. He was dependable. He was quiet. He was fair. All the things people said about him, all the things he allowed people to say about him, were true. But beneath that surface, under that quiet strength, was a gnawing emptiness, a silence that wasn't peaceful but deafening. He pictured his childhood, the chaotic blur of neglect, the constant scramble for safety, for food, for just a moment of peace. He'd channeled the fear and the anger into work, into survival. But what had he survived for? To repeat the same cycles, just in a different setting. To build nothing, create nothing, risk nothing. The profound sadness that often lurked beneath his gruff exterior now surged, hot and bitter. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to bury it, to deny its existence, that he hadn't realized it was still dictating his future. It wasn't just a ghost. It was a puppeteer pulling the strings of his fear, keeping him small, keeping him safe from the very thing he secretly craved. To build something lasting, something that mattered. The shame of it washed over him. All those years, all that potential, locked away, deemed unworthy. He had become exactly what his past had tried to make him. Just enough, never more. The air felt thick, pressing down on his chest. His inability to trust, his tendency to internalize every struggle, had left him isolated, a quiet island in a sea of people. He was tired. So deeply, profoundly tired of carrying that invisible weight, of fighting that unseen battle with his own self-worth. The scars from his childhood weren't just on his soul. They were etched into his very being, dictating his every move, every quiet decision to shrink rather than to soar. But tonight, for the first time, he felt a flicker of defiance beneath the crushing weight. A tiny, burning ember of a different possibility. One Tuesday morning, just as the second shift was winding down and the air in the plant thickened with the smell of hot metal and fatigue, Eugene saw something that rattled the foundations he'd spent a lifetime constructing. He was at his station, methodically checking the tension on a conveyor belt, the kind of repetitive task he could do in his sleep, when a younger man, Marcus, came bustling past. Marcus was barely out of his 20s, fresh-faced despite the grime, with an infectious energy that often rubbed Eugene the wrong way. The kid had a past, a rough one, everyone knew it, bounced around foster homes, dropped out of school early, the whole 9 yards. Sounded eerily familiar to Eugene's own early life, only Marcus seemed to wear his scars differently. Marcus stopped, not in front of Eugene, but beside him, pulling a tattered notebook from his oil-stained overalls. "Hey, Eugene," he said, not waiting for a response. "Remember that grinding issue on line 7? The one that was costing us a whole half-hour of downtime every day last week?" Eugene grunted, not looking up. He remembered. He just figured it was another problem to live with. "Well, I got it," Marcus announced, a wide, genuine grin splitting his face. "Turns out if you just tweak the angle of the feeder plate by about 3 degrees, just a hair, it eliminates the back pressure." Been running smooth since lunch. Eugene slowly straightened up, the wrench still in his hand. He looked at Marcus, at the triumphant light in his eyes, not for recognition or reward, but for the sheer satisfaction of having fixed something. It wasn't a billion-dollar idea, not even a million-dollar one. It was a simple, practical solution to a persistent headache on the factory floor, the kind of small victory that goes unnoticed by management but saves real money and real frustration for the guys doing the work. For a moment, Eugene felt the familiar flicker of annoyance, a knee-jerk resentment for anyone who dared to show enthusiasm in this gray world. But then something else surfaced. He saw Marcus, not as a younger, irritating version of himself, but as a mirror. Marcus had faced the same kind of early life hardships, the same neglect, the same feeling of having to fight for every scrap. Yet here he was, not just surviving, but thriving in his own small way, finding solutions, making things better. He wasn't trying to bury his past. He was using the lessons of self-reliance, of figuring things out when no one else would, to propel him forward. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't paralyzed. A profound realization hit Eugene with the force of a physical blow. If Marcus, with his history, could find a way to use his difficult past as a launchpad, why couldn't he? Why had Eugene spent a lifetime seeing his own scar, not just as a wound, but as a permanent, debilitating flaw? He'd carried it like a dead weight, a constant proof of his inadequacy. But looking at Marcus, he saw something different. He saw that his own difficult past wasn't just a source of pain. It was a reservoir of raw experience, of fierce determination, of a stubborn refusal to break. It had made him who he was, yes, but it didn't have to define his limits. It could be channeled differently. He began to see his past not as a weakness, but as a unique strength, a deep well of resilience that had been forged in fire. The thought was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly alien. That night, the clock in Eugene's modest, quiet house ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2, eventually settling on the lonely, honest hour of 3 a.m. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent hum of the factory still echoing faintly in his ears, though he hadn't left his mattress. Marcus's face, his triumphant, simple grin, kept replaying in his mind. The raw truth of it was almost unbearable. He tossed, punched his pillow. The usual defenses, the thick walls he'd built over 4 decades, felt like they were crumbling around him. What had his life become? He was 48, alone in a house that felt less like a home and more like a shelter from the storm. The bills were paid, sure, the fridge was stocked, the car ran. He was dependable, he was quiet, he was fair. All the things people said about him, all the things he allowed people to say about him, were true. But beneath that surface, under that quiet strength, was a gnawing emptiness, a silence that wasn't peaceful but deafening. He pictured his childhood, the chaotic blur of neglect, the constant scramble for safety, for food, for just a moment of peace. He'd channeled the fear and the anger into work, into survival. But what had he survived for? To repeat the same cycles, just in a different setting. To build nothing, create nothing, risk nothing. The profound sadness that often lurked beneath his gruff exterior now surged, hot and bitter. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to bury it, to deny its existence, that he hadn't realized it was still dictating his future. It wasn't just a ghost. It was a puppeteer pulling the strings of his fear, keeping him small, keeping him safe from the very thing he secretly craved. To build something lasting, something that mattered. The shame of it washed over him. All those years, all that potential, locked away, deemed unworthy. He had become exactly what his past had tried to make him. Just enough, never more. The air felt thick, pressing down on his chest. His inability to trust, his tendency to internalize every struggle had left him isolated, a quiet island in a sea of people. He was tired. So deeply, profoundly tired of carrying that invisible weight, of fighting that unseen battle with his own self-worth. The scars from his childhood weren't just on his soul. They were etched into his very being, dictating his every move, every quiet decision to shrink rather than to soar. But tonight, for the first time, he felt a flicker of defiance beneath the crushing weight. A tiny, burning ember of a different possibility. That tiny ember, barely alight, felt fragile, almost foolish against the cold, hard reality of his life. But it was there. And then one Tuesday it caught a breeze. It was just another Tuesday on the production line, the rhythmic clang and hiss of machinery a soundtrack to his life. Eugene was fixing a jammed conveyor, his knuckles bruised, when Kevin, a kid barely out of his 20s, started talking. Kevin was new, fresh out of the foster care system, and still carried that raw, unsettled energy of someone who'd learned to rely on nobody but himself. Eugene had seen it in his own reflection for years. Kevin was laughing, a genuine, unguarded sound that felt out of place in the grimy factory. "Hey, Eugene," Kevin said, wiping grease from his brow with the back of a hand. "Remember that hiccup last week with the new hydraulic press? The one that kept seizing up on line 3? Eugene grunted, remembering. It had cost them hours. "Well," Kevin continued, a proud grin stretching his face, "I messed around with it over the weekend, just thinking. Used some old parts from the scrap bin and a trick my old foster dad showed me for balancing uneven pressure. It's been running smooth as a baby's bottom since this morning. Foreman's actually talking about putting my fix on the whole line. It was a small thing, really. A minor engineering tweak, a clever improvisation." But as Kevin spoke, animated, a light in his eyes that Eugene hadn't seen in his own for decades, something shifted. Kevin hadn't just fixed a machine, he'd fixed a problem that others, more experienced, had simply accepted. And he'd done it not despite his rough upbringing, but in some strange way because of it. Eugene saw the resourcefulness, the grit, the refusal to take no for an answer, qualities forged in the crucible of neglect, survival instincts honed sharp. Kevin hadn't let his past paralyze him. He'd used it. He'd channeled that same fire, that same deep-seated need to fix what was broken, into something productive, something that contributed. Eugene stared at the younger man, then at his own scarred, calloused hands. The anger, the fear, the constant echoes of his own chaotic childhood. For so long, he'd seen them as shackles, a permanent stain. But what if they weren't? What if they were the very forge that had made him tough enough to survive this life? What if the intense drive he'd always had, born from a need to prove himself, to overcome, could be channeled not just into surviving, but into building? A profound realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His own scar wasn't just a wound. It was a reservoir, a deep well of raw experience and fierce determination, forged in fire, that had made him who he was. He'd always seen it as his weakness, but maybe, just maybe, it was his unique strength. That night's sleep was a distant shore he couldn't reach. He lay awake in his modest, quiet house, the digital glow of his alarm clock mocking him with the time. 3:17 a.m. The house was too quiet, the silence amplifying the frantic tumble of thoughts in his head. His own breath seemed too loud, a ragged sound in the still darkness. He stared at the ceiling, seeing not plaster, but a lifetime of missed turns and buried potential. What had he become? A dependable cog in a vast machine, a man who paid his bills on time, who kept his lawn neat, who never caused trouble. And what else? Nothing. He was a ghost walking through his own life, haunted by the what-ifs and might-have-beens. The raw honesty of the hour stripped him bare. He saw the years rolling behind him, a landscape of hard work, yes, but also of profound loneliness, of dreams discarded like so much factory scrap. He'd always told himself he was just being practical, realistic. But now, in the stark, merciless light of 3 a.m., he saw the lie. It wasn't practicality, it was fear. Fear born from the chaos of his childhood, the constant threat of loss, of abandonment. He'd walled himself off, not just from others, but from the possibility of building something great, something that might risk failure. If you built nothing, you couldn't lose it. If you tried for nothing, you couldn't fall short. He had aimed for just enough because just enough felt safe, secure, a stark contrast to the insecurity of his early years. The thought of Kevin's simple triumph, that flicker of light in his young eyes, pierced through Eugene's self-imposed darkness. Kevin had dared to use his past, not hide from it. He had taken his scars, his hard-won lessons, and turned them into something useful, something to be proud of. And Eugene, he had let his be a cage. He had allowed the fear of vulnerability, the terror of true success, because success meant higher stakes, more to lose, to keep him chained to a life of quiet struggle. A profound sadness, deeper than any he'd felt in years, welled up. It wasn't just sadness for his past. It was sadness for the present, for the man he was, for the man he had allowed himself not to be. He had been a survivor, yes, but surviving wasn't living. It wasn't building. It wasn't thriving. He had simply existed, carrying the invisible weight of his past, letting it define his limits instead of fuel his rise. The quiet strength he possessed, the resilience that had seen him through so much, had been wasted on mere endurance. But the flicker from earlier, that defiant ember, refused to die. It started to glow brighter, fueled by the brutal honesty of the dark night. He had been strong enough to survive. Was he strong enough to finally live? He sat there in the silence, the pale pre-dawn light just beginning to bleed through the blinds. The question echoed, bouncing off the worn walls of his modest house. Strong enough to finally live? The answer, when it came, wasn't a roar. It was a whisper deep from his gut, a quiet, undeniable enough. Enough of this existence. Enough of just getting by. Enough of letting the shadows of his childhood dictate the size of his future. He didn't know how to live differently, not exactly. He didn't have a grand plan, no sudden blueprint for a billion-dollar empire. No visions of grandeur, just a deep, gnawing certainty that the just enough wasn't enough anymore. It was a suffocating blanket. The thought of another day, another year, another decade of merely enduring, of burying himself under routine and self-pity, twisted something inside him. He knew, with a clarity that stung and exhilarated him at the same time, that he couldn't keep doing what he was doing. The next morning, the alarm blared at 5 a.m. like it always did. For a split second, the old inertia, the comfortable despair, tried to pull him back under. What's the point? The familiar voice whispered. You're still the same Eugene. You'll always be the broken kid, patching things up, never building anything real. He felt the crushing weight of it, a physical ache in his chest, the old shame trying to reassert its grip. But then he remembered Kevin's face, remembered that quiet resolve, remembered the profound realization that his own past wasn't just a wound. It was a forge. All those years of fending for himself, of solving problems no one else would touch, of learning to mend and build with whatever scraps he found, that wasn't weakness. That was a unique kind of strength, honed in fire. He might not be fancy, he might not have a degree, but he knew how things worked, how to make something out of nothing. That, he realized, was his arsenal, forged in the very fires he'd always tried to extinguish. He forced himself out of bed, the usual exhaustion still present, but with a new, subtle current running underneath it. It wasn't enthusiasm, not yet. It was pure, stubborn defiance. That day at the factory, he didn't just punch in and disappear into the drone of the production line. He started to look, really look. For years, he'd seen the same old inefficiencies, the same bottlenecks, the same wear and tear on machines that everyone just accepted. There was a particular conveyor belt on line 3, notorious for its constant, small jams, always causing fractional delays that added up over a shift. A low-level frustration everyone had learned to live with, to instinctively work around. Eugene himself had nudged it back into alignment, adjusted the sensor, tapped the side of it with a rubber mallet hundreds of times. His hands knew its quirks better than he knew his own reflection. But today was different. Today, he didn't just work around it. He paused, watching it with a different kind of focus, like an investigator at a crime scene. He saw the subtle wobble in the main roller, the slight misalignment in the tracking mechanism that everyone else missed, or just deemed part of the job. He saw it not as an annoyance, but as a challenge, an echo of all the broken things he'd had to fix growing up: the leaky faucet, the rattling window pane, the bike chain always slipping. His mind, usually a quiet storm of internal struggles and old anxieties, was suddenly alive, connecting the dots, visualizing solutions. The same deep-seated resilience that had once been about finding food or keeping a roof over his head, about making a broken thing work because there was no other choice, was now sparking an idea about a simple, overlooked mechanism. He spent his lunch break not in the break room, but hunched over a small, greasy notebook he'd carried for years, filled with random notes, mostly parts numbers and crude repair diagrams. Now he was sketching a modification, a small but ingenious adjustment to the conveyor's guide rails that would eliminate the wobble, simplify the tracking. It wasn't revolutionary, not yet. It was practical. It was resourceful. It was born of necessity, of making do with less, of finding the simplest, most effective way to solve a problem that others had just learned to live with. It was Eugene, channeling his past not as a burden but as a blueprint for ingenuity. He felt a faint, unfamiliar stir. Not happiness, not exactly, but a deep sense of purpose, like a rusty gear finally beginning to turn. The familiar fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, fear of being wrong, fear of being laughed at, fear of attracting attention, fear of losing that safe, invisible space he'd carved out for himself. But for the first time in a long time, the fear was not enough to stop him. He had a problem to solve. And for the first time, he realized he didn't just have a problem, he was a solution, a testament to what could be forged in the crucible of hard times. He felt a quiet, defiant resolve settle in his bones, an unshakable belief that perhaps, just perhaps, his greatest weaknesses were actually his hidden strengths. This was day one of looking at the world and himself with new eyes. The quiet resolve might have settled in his bones, but the world didn't just roll over and applaud Eugene's newfound perspective. Day 2 began, and the weight of the factory floor felt heavier, the roar of the machines more insistent, as if challenging his audacity. He tried to approach Mr. Henderson, the line supervisor, during a brief lull, his greasy notebook clutched in his hand. "Mr. Henderson," he started, his voice a gravelly rumble, "I've been thinking about that conveyor wobble on line 3. Got a drawing here, a way to simplify the tracking, cut down on wear and tear." Henderson, a man whose patience was as thin as his hair, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Eugene, we've got quotas to hit. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if it is broke, put a work order in. Save your doodads for your lunch break." He waved a dismissive hand, already moving on. A familiar coldness washed over Eugene, a sensation he knew intimately. The sting of being ignored, of having his efforts brushed aside. It was the same feeling he'd had as a boy, presenting a meticulously drawn picture to a mother too preoccupied, a father too absent. The old voices, the ones that whispered, "You're not good enough, you're invisible," started to hum. He retreated, the unshared drawings feeling like lead in his pocket. He wanted to chuck the notebook into the nearest bin, go back to being the quiet shadow, letting the world wash over him without making a ripple. But then he remembered the spark, the young man from foster care, and the quiet defiance he'd felt just yesterday. He tucked the notebook back into his toolbox, a stubborn, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not today, he thought. Not yet. By day 7, the quiet struggle had intensified. His lunch breaks, once dedicated to wolfing down a sandwich, were now spent in the dusty corner of the stockroom, poring over industrial manuals borrowed from maintenance, cross-referencing parts, refining his design. He wasn't just fixing the wobble anymore. He was envisioning a whole new, more efficient system for the entire line. The ambition, once a buried seed, was starting to sprout, demanding light and water. But the exhaustion was real. After 10 hours on his feet, the thought of coming home to a quiet house and then immediately diving into diagrams and calculations felt like a second shift he hadn't clocked into. His mind, usually a fortress, felt permeable, the old anxieties seeping in. He started trying to fix things for neighbors on the side, a way to test his ingenuity and earn a little extra cash. Mrs. Gable's ancient washing machine had given him a run for his money. He'd spent 3 evenings in her humid basement, tools spread out, muttering to himself, convinced he'd found the issue, only for it to sputter and die again. On the third night, a fuse blew, plunging the basement into darkness, and a wave of despair, cold and heavy, crashed over him. He sat there in the sudden silence, the smell of damp concrete and burnt wire filling his nostrils, the dim light from the street lamp filtering through a small, grimy window. This is it, he thought, staring at his grimy hands. This is what you're good for. Breaking things, making them worse. The memory of his father's frustrated sighs, his mother's sharp words about wasted effort, echoed in the darkness. He felt the pull of the familiar, the comfort of knowing his place, however small. Why try to climb out of the ditch when the ground was so much softer at the bottom? He closed his eyes, the image of that small, broken washing machine burning behind his eyelids like a symbol of his own futility. But a funny thing happened in that dark, damp basement. He didn't just sit there. He reached for his phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly, methodically started packing his tools. He might not have fixed the washer tonight, but he hadn't walked away either. He wasn't giving up on Mrs. Gable, he was just hitting pause. And in that quiet, determined action, he found a sliver of strength, a whisper that said, "Tomorrow is another day. You faced worse than a blown fuse." By day 14, the factory hummed with its usual indifferent rhythm, but Eugene felt like he was walking through thick mud. He'd refined his conveyor design to near perfection, he believed, even incorporating a few safety improvements. He'd even written up a concise proposal. He finally worked up the nerve to leave it on Mr. Henderson's desk, marked, "Urgent." He watched from a distance, heart thrumming an unfamiliar beat as Henderson picked it up, glanced at the cover sheet, and then, with a barely suppressed groan, tossed it onto a towering pile of other paperwork on the corner of his desk. It wasn't a direct rejection, not with words, but the message was clear as a punch to the gut. Unseen, unimportant. That evening, the anger, long buried and simmering, finally found a vent. Not an explosion. Eugene didn't do explosions. He went to his small, tidy garage, picked up an old, rusted wrench, and meticulously, savagely began to polish it. The metal gleamed under his steady strokes, a reflection of his own frustrated determination. He thought of the endless shifts, the aching back, the years of quiet compliance. He thought of the cold dinners, the empty fridge when he was a kid, the relentless pressure to just survive. He thought of every time he'd been told to stay in his lane, to not dream too big, to know his place. And with each stroke of the cloth, a stubborn resistance grew. He wasn't doing this for Henderson. He wasn't doing this for applause. He was doing this for the boy who'd had to teach himself how to tie a knot, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to make a broken toy whole again because no one else would. He was doing this because the pain of staying where he was, unseen and unheard, had finally become greater than the fear of trying. The scar wasn't just a mark of what he'd survived. It was the raw, unyielding material he was now using to build. Each polished facet of the old wrench reflected a renewed, silent vow. He would not be discarded. He would not be ignored. The polished wrench found its home on a hook in the garage, a silent promise hanging in the cool air. The next morning, 5 a.m., came as always. Eugene pulled on his work boots, the laces tied with a familiar double knot. But something had shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of energy, not a dramatic change. It was a subtle hum beneath the surface, like a dormant engine finally catching a spark. At the factory, the rhythms of the machines were unchanged, the clatter and hiss a familiar symphony of industrial life. Yet Eugene's ears seemed to pick up new notes. He saw the worn gears, the stressed joints, the bottlenecks in the production line not just as defects to be tolerated, but as challenges to be overcome. He started watching the younger colleague, the one who'd sparked the initial crack, a kid named Leo, trying to troubleshoot a recurring snag on the assembly. Most workers would offer a quick, gruff piece of advice and move on. Eugene, however, paused. He watched the boy struggle, the same frustration he knew so well playing on Leo's face. "Leverage," Eugene said, his voice a low rumble, unexpected. Leo jumped, startled, then looked up. Eugene pointed with a calloused finger, not at the obvious problem, but at a seemingly innocuous bracket further down the line. You're fighting the weight there. Shift the fulcrum. He didn't elaborate, just walked away, leaving Leo to puzzle it out. An hour later, Eugene saw Leo grinning, the snag fixed. A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed through Eugene. A connection. A faint echo of a boy teaching himself, fixing things no one else cared about. The changes continued to unfurl like a slow sunrise after a long night. Eugene started sketching ideas on spare scraps of paper during his lunch break, modified jigs, redesigned grips for tools, a better way to route the cables on a machine that always tangled. Henderson, the supervisor, still dismissed his official suggestions, but Eugene found other avenues. He started talking more, not much, but enough to share a quick tip with a new hire or explain the underlying mechanics of a problem to a curious peer. He found himself answering questions, his deep knowledge of the machinery, once just a means to an end, now a resource. People started seeking him out, drawn by his quiet competence and the unexpected depth of his insight. "Ask Eugene," became a quiet refrain on the floor. One afternoon, during a particularly chaotic rush, a critical part feeder jammed, threatening to halt the entire line. Panic rippled through the section. Henderson barked orders, but the usual fixes weren't working. Eugene, without a word, walked over. He didn't use a diagram, didn't consult a manual. He just felt the machine. His hands, gnarled and scarred, moved with a practiced grace, tracing the path of the mechanism, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He remembered a similar jam from his own childhood, trying to fix a sputtering old lawnmower his father had abandoned, the frustration and the eventual, satisfying click of things falling into place. He found the subtle misalignment, a hair's breadth off, that was causing the issue. A precise tap, a small adjustment to a sensor, and the feeder whirred back to life. The line hummed again. Henderson, for once, was speechless. The relief was palpable. Weeks blurred into months. Eugene didn't become a different man overnight, but he was certainly not the man he had been. The tiredness in his eyes was still there, a testament to decades of hard labor, but now it was tempered by a new kind of light, a quiet fire. His shoulders, once habitually slumped, carried a subtle purpose. He was still a man of few words, but those words now carried weight, respect. His small, well-kept house became more than just a place to sleep. In his garage, amidst the scent of oil and old wood, he started building. Not just the sketches from the factory, but small, useful items for his neighbors. A sturdy ramp for an elderly woman. A robust bird feeder that wouldn't fall apart in the wind, even fixing complex appliances that others had given up on. He worked with a meticulous focus, each successful repair, each precisely cut piece of wood, a quiet affirmation. The money wasn't much, not at first, but the feeling of creating, of solving, of providing something tangible and reliable was a currency he hadn't known he craved. He started calling it Eugene's Solutions, a wry, self-deprecating nod to his new enterprise. At the factory, his reputation solidified. He wasn't just Eugene from Section 7 anymore. He was Eugene, the one who fixed the feeder. Eugene, who knows how to make that old machine sing. When the plant manager announced a new initiative to improve efficiency across all production lines, he didn't just ask for volunteers. He specifically asked for Eugene. Henderson, surprised, could only nod. Eugene, initially hesitant, accepted. He found himself leading a small team, a group of younger workers, including Leo. He didn't bark orders or demand submission. He taught, he guided, he listened. He shared stories, not grand tales of triumph, but practical anecdotes from his own life, from his own difficult youth. He talked about how he learned to make do with nothing, how necessity had sharpened his wits, how he'd learned to see problems not as dead ends, but as puzzles. "When you've got nothing," he'd tell them, his gaze steady, "you learn to build with what you've got, even if it's just your own stubbornness." He didn't use the word trauma, but he openly acknowledged the difficult roads he'd traveled, framing them not as excuses, but as the very forge that had shaped his unique ability to see solutions where others saw only despair. He showed them how his past, the very thing he'd tried to bury, had given him an eye for what was broken, and more importantly, the will to fix it. His silent ambition, born from a desperate need for survival, had finally found its voice. It wasn't a loud voice, but it resonated with authenticity, built on the solid bedrock of a life lived through hardship, and the quiet, undeniable strength that had been forged in the fire of neglect. He wasn't just building things anymore. He was building people up, showing them how to build themselves, using their own scars as blueprints. The atmosphere on Eugene's line began to hum with a different kind of energy. It wasn't just faster production, it was smarter. Small bottlenecks that had frustrated workers for years suddenly found simple, elegant solutions, often proposed by Leo or another young man, then refined by Eugene's quiet wisdom. There was less shouting, more talking, more actual listening. Henderson, making his rounds, would stop, an eyebrow raised, watching Eugene's teamwork. He'd see Eugene demonstrating a new jig he'd cobbled together from scrap, a way to hold a part steady with less effort, and the young workers, instead of just mechanically copying, would be asking questions, engaged. The improvements piled up, small but significant, shaving minutes off processes, reducing waste, increasing quality. Word spread through the factory. "Go ask Eugene," people started saying, not just about a broken machine, but about a tricky problem, a difficult situation. He wasn't just fixing things, he was fostering a culture where problems were seen as challenges, not just inevitable headaches. Hope, a fragile seedling, began to sprout not just in Eugene, but in the people around him. They saw what he was doing, how he was doing it, and a flicker ignited within them, a realization that maybe their own tough roads had given them something too. Months turned into a year. The small initiative became the blueprint for plant-wide improvements. Eugene, the quiet factory worker, found himself in meeting rooms with plant managers and corporate strategists. His voice, though still calm, now carrying an undeniable weight. He didn't use jargon. He used examples from the factory floor, stories of specific challenges, and the practical, often ingenious, solutions his team had devised. He spoke of resilience not as a buzzword, but as the everyday grit of people who'd learned to make something out of nothing. His side business, a small workshop tucked behind his modest home, had steadily grown. What started as fixing broken appliances for neighbors evolved into fabricating custom tools and specialized parts for local tradesmen, demand coming purely through word of mouth. His hands, still calloused and scarred, were now also tools of creation, not just labor. He was no longer just punching a clock. He was building, creating, leading. He didn't forget the fear of failure, the echoes of not good enough. But they were no longer paralyzing. They were a distant rumble, drowned out by the steady rhythm of purpose, the quiet hum of the workshop, and the growing confidence in his own hard-won abilities. The factory floor was still his home, but now he walked it with a different stride, the weight on his shoulders replaced by the strength in his step. One late afternoon, as the last shift bell rang, Leo lingered. Watched Eugene carefully clean his workbench, a ritual of respect for the tools, for the work itself. "Eugene," Leo said, his voice hesitant, How do you do it? All of it, after everything you've been through?" Eugene paused, his gaze drifting towards the massive steel doors of the plant, towards the setting sun painting the sky in industrial hues of orange and gray. He turned, his eyes, still tired but now full of a deep, understanding light, met Leo's. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of years of hard lessons given voice. "My whole life I thought what happened to me, that chaotic start, it was a curse. A heavy weight I had to drag every single day. I was ashamed of it, you know. Tried to bury it under long shifts, under quiet weekends, tried to pretend it never happened or that it didn't shape me. I felt like I was always fighting an invisible battle, always telling myself I wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of anything more than just getting by." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But then, when you spoke up that day, something shifted. I started seeing it differently. That weight, that struggle, it didn't break me. It made me strong. It forced me to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet when no one else would. It taught me how to figure things out, how to see problems, and then how to solve them because there was no other option. That scar," Eugene said, holding up a gnarled hand, pointing to a faint white line etched across his knuckles. "This scar, it ain't a sign of what broke me, son. It's proof of what built me. It's the record of every damn time I got knocked down and got back up. It's what gave me the resilience, the drive, the eye for what's broken, and the will to fix it. And if I can build something real out of that, out of all that hard truth, anyone can use their own hard times to build something real. You just gotta learn to see the forge, not just the fire."